Ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to everybody, friends, co-authors, fans, admirers of Paul Erdős. Special thanks to the leaders of the Academy, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and the Vice Rector of the Erdős University for supporting our celebration by their presence. Now I call Vera, one of the two chairs of the conference, to address the meeting.
Dear Mr. President, dear guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my privilege and great pleasure to welcome the participants of this conference from all over the world. This is the third conference we are organizing about Paul Erdős, and this conference was all the two previous times in the building of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. The first was in 1996, one day after his funeral. At that one-day meeting, our goal was to give an immediate short survey of his oeuvre, a demonstration of his unique role in mathematics in the past 6 decades. The second conference was 3 years later, in 1999, when our primary aim was to cover as much as possible the full scope and richness of his mathematics and its impact. Now, celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth, our intention is to give a panorama of the monumental, enormous development originated in his mathematics, of the wide-ranging influence of his work, and to give some indication of possible trends in the future. Obviously, the composition of the participants at this meeting is different. We are very glad to have so many young mathematicians, to have here so many mathematicians, which is very much in the spirit of Paul Erdős and very much in the spirit of our president and of the academy. So, to formulate it very briefly, the first conference was about the past, the second about the past and the present, and I feel and hope that this third one is about the past, the present, and the future. One of the organizing institutions, the host and the venue of all the 3 conferences is the same, the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Let me thank at this point Professor József Pálinkás, President of the Academy and the main patron of this conference, for his special attention and support during the whole time we prepared for that meeting. Let me add that incidentally, Erdős gave his inaugural address in this very same ceremonial hall after being elected in 1956 as a member of the Academy. Now let me say a few words about the characteristics of Erdős mathematics. A special trait was his unparalleled power of formulating and posing problems and conjectures. He must have had a special sense for good problems. How else can we explain that many of his innocent-looking problems open up new eras, in some cases after several decades. Another characteristic of his mathematics was that very often his questions and proofs reveal deep relationships between different eras in mathematics that could not have been foreseen. This conference will give many examples for and consequences of these two characteristics of Erdős mathematics. Now say a few words about the main topics of Erdős mathematics and at the same time about the program of this conference. Erdős started out as a number theorist, discovering the combinatorial nature of some of his early number theory problems led him to general questions in combinatorics in graph theory. His set theory also often arose from an infinite version of the finite cases, and his results and problems in geometry and algebra also have a combinatorial flavor. He was one of the initiators of probabilistic number theory, and he used the methods and principles of probability throughout his work. The probabilistic method and the Erdős-Rényi theory of random graphs are major examples, but he also worked in pure probability theory. Analysis, interpolation, and polynomials in particular were also in the foreground of his research from the 30s through the 60s, but his analytic power is felt in his paper along, and we also will see the continuation of his work from this time. Just as personality showed through each time he spoke about mathematics, it is impossible to talk about his mathematics without touching very briefly on his personality. I just mentioned one quote from one of his letters in 1976. And now, will I be able? Yeah, I hope. It is 6 in the morning, the house is still asleep. I listen to lovely music while writing and conjecturing. Now here you see the Hungarian version, which is, in my opinion, quite poetic, and it is hard to give its flavor in English. When Erdős was 20, Isaac Schur, let me see the next one, called him, I am sorry for the misprint, der Zauberer von Budapest, the magician from Budapest. He was called the Mozart of mathematics, the Occidental Ramanujan, and the Euler of the 20th century. One might wonder who will be called the Erdős of the 21st century. In closing, let me wish everybody a successful, pleasant conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, József Pálinkás, the president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, the distinguished main patron of the conference, will give his welcoming speech.
When I am in a good mood, I do some mathematics to feel even better. When I am in a bad mood, I do some mathematics to banish that bad mood. This is how once Pál Erdős quoted Erdős-Rényi. Honorable professors, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and fellow scientists, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of a genius, who, in Rényi's sense, was in a good mood in most of his life, and in the rest, tried to banish that bad mood. He was a truly exceptional mathematician who achieved outstanding results in number theory, combinatorics, set theory, and probability theory. He worked in almost every branch of mathematics and achieved equally outstanding results in the practical application of mathematics. A mathematician, as he liked to say, is a machine for turning coffee into theorems. 1,521, according to the Nature, scientific publications, significant theorems, and proofs stand as a clear evidence of the supremely rich, lively, and in a sense merry awe of an exceptional mathematician's mind. For Pál Erdős, mathematics was life. We may therefore presume that by understanding his mathematics, we may study the fundamental structure of his life. We can engage in mathematics under any circumstances, he claimed, even in an internment camp. Pál Erdős solved many deep mathematical problems. However, his mathematics was not only the science of solutions, but also the science of recognizing and grasping problems. Some believe, including the Abel Prize winner Hungarian mathematician Erdős Szemerédi, that his greatness lay in having elevated the ability to recognize mathematical problems to an almost artistic level. Good answers can only be obtained if we asked the right questions. This is how this exceptional mathematician, this unique mind, Pál Erdős, inspired generations of scientists for a whole century to work out new proofs and truly scientific answers. The child prodigy was shaped into a world-famous mathematician, a unique individual, and a memorable scientist by the scientific view of life brought from home and a cruel and stormy century. The man who loved only numbers, this was the title of his biography. However, all of us who are celebrating the 100th anniversary of his birth today at this conference are well aware that the word only in this context does not mean exclusion, but on the contrary, inclusion. The large number of co-authors, the Erdős number, the mathematical questions posed and answered, and the prizes established and awarded, all stands as a proof of the fact that these numbers are not only about themselves, but also about the scientific community and the future of science. Honorable participants of this Centennial celebratory conference, Pál Erdős recalled in a number of interviews that he was 40 years old when he told his mother that if we deduct 250 from 100, we obtain 150 beneath zero. Today, we should only add to this 100 Erdős's 100 years. This conference, the lecturers of all those to whose careers he made a contribution, whether directly or indirectly, serves to celebrate him. Perhaps also with a view to indicate that Erdős may not have been fully right on one thing, namely when he said in his very own unmistakable style that the human destiny was pessimistic, at least inasmuch as man lives for a short time and is dead for a long time. The number and the prominence of the participants of this conference, in my view, is a clear proof that even if Pál Erdős is not alive, his memory, his impact, and legacy is still living and will live for a very long time. Now, but in my capacity as the president of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, I welcome all of you here and salute Pál Erdős. I sincerely hope that this conference will indeed prove that his memory, his impact and legacy is still very much alive. I wish you all an important and thought-provoking conference with Pál Erdős' own invitation. Are your brains open? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now we will see a short movie. George Paul Ciceri has shot an excellent documentary movie about Pál Erdős in the years 1988 until 1991 under the title N is a Number. This movie was very successful. I think many of you have seen it. Now, Mr. Ciceri has updated, extended this movie, and you will see a short preview of this new version.
Hello?
Well, it was 1934, I think, that he came to Manchester. He was then 21. This young man came and seemed more unpractical than one could have believed. It took a whole department to look after him.
Who is alive among those people who were in Manchester?
I met Uncle Paul when I was in high school.
He invited me to the best restaurants in Budapest.
I solved one of the problems that Erdős posed.
Which turned into a paper.
I have many friends all over the world, many friends and collaborators. After all, I wrote joint papers with maybe 300 people.
He really started with the simple problem, and most of these questions he asked led to really very relevant and very general results.
Now then, a number is called abundant.
Asymptotic thinking, since the 60s, has become the bread and butter of theoretical computer science. And that's one of the places where the Erdős type thinking is the foundation.
There's a perception that he was just focused only on math, and he really cared a lot about other things than math.
He was often very sorry that people had to suffer.
Through his influence, through his problems, through his solutions, so I am pretty sure that Erdős's work is going to live forever.
Butaságban szenvedek, nagyon sok pénzt küldenek, vagy úgy is lehet mondani, kitüntetéseket küldenek, szép új tételt kaphatnám, 100 ilyenért nem adnám.
will be László Lovász, the other chair of the conference.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, friends and of Erdős, Paul Erdős, I would like to show a few pictures. Now, there are many, many pictures, photos of Paul Erdős all over the internet, and so I will only show you three, which are somehow somewhat special. This one actually you have seen in the movie too, which is from the Episcopal Church of St. Gregory in Nyssa, San Francisco. This shows Erdős dancing. It's called the Dancing Saints. And the idea of this wall in this church is to show people who could have been saints by their life, by their devotion to mankind and humanity. So here you can see Uncle Paul dancing happily between Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther. The second picture is about Erdős and epsilons, and you see here an epsilon who actually is a participant of this conference, a student helper. So you should remember the face so that you can easily recognize him and, request some help from him. That's why that's one of the reasons why he's here. Now, I was going to issue a question to all participants. How many participants of this meeting have sat on the lap of Paul Erdős? But it turns out that you cannot really come up with any new idea in connection with Paul. It turns out that the Erdős lap number has been defined. The definition is that the Erdős lap number 0 is Erdős himself, and if somebody sits on the lap of somebody with Erdős lap number I, then he thereby acquires an Erdős lap number I+1. And there is a website where you can report this kind of number. So I came up with another idea, the Erdős babysitting number. This is defined as Erdős has babysitting number 0. Whomever he was babysitting for has Erdős babysitting number 1, and so on. I'm proud to say that this is not an empty number, so I know actually quite a few people with Erdős babysitting number 2. I don't know, it probably has already gone past that. So the point is really that Erdős is often depicted, of course, as a great, fantastic mathematician, quite often as a somewhat eccentric person, but actually he was a very warm person who was in very close friendship with many, many of us. And this included things like babysitting for my oldest daughter. And this justifies the introduction of this new concept. Here is a third picture, which was, I think, taken by George Ciceri, and shows Paul Erdős with two of his childhood friends, Tibor Gallai and Márta Svéd. I'm showing this picture because we do have a special session this afternoon commemorating not Paul Erdős, but another former member of our academy, Tibor Gallai, who was a very close friend of Paul Erdős, and they wrote many papers together, and we thought it was appropriate to devote session to this connection, to this other great mathematician. I think it's time to finish this opening ceremony. Erdős would not have liked very much to have this kind of ceremonies, but maybe I can say that I'm very, very happy that there are so many young people who are attending this meeting, and I think it's totally would be in the spirit of Paul Erdős to encourage these people to listen to problems, to try to solve them, to interact, to talk to each other, to make friendships, and thereby create the community that will maintain and further develop all this work that Paul Erdős started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and this is the end of the opening ceremony. The scientific program will start in 5 minutes with the lecture of Béla Bollobás.
Ebben meg tudom tenni, csak a lámpát mert most már madonnal fogok ember. Kapcsolsz ki? Igen, persze. És ki fog csúszni a kábel. És akkor még. Mindjárt elmondjuk. Tessék? Persze.
Egész akár lehet tenni ide is.
Ja, oké. Csak akkor...
A Bélát felmikrofonozzátok? Mert az nagyon rossz volt, hogy jól látszik beszél, és a Béla rossz sokkal össze. Ezt arról beszéltünk, hogy kapjon egy csiptetős vagy felmérhető.
Pillanat, ne arra, hogy itt valami az első oldalra kéne menni. Prezenter működik. Az a probléma, hogy hozni játszani, olyan kezdődtem, akkor és rátenni a segíteni. Jó, persze.
Professzor, de nem kapcsolva most. Tessék, amit hall, vagy beszélünk, az mindenki. Már késő G is rengeteg. Már 45 perc. 40, hát nem úgyse lesz kérdés.
I am very glad to introduce Béla Bollobás. He has been my very good friend for more than 50 years. Béla Bollobás is the member of the Royal Society and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He's a professor at Cambridge and Memphis. Béla has had an enormous number of absolutely top PhD students. He has written many excellent books and lot of papers, in most of them containing breakthrough results. So I don't think so I should say more than that, except that I heard Laci and that he wanted to show, and he did show a picture of Paul Erdős. Actually, I wanted to do the same things, to show some pictures about Béla, but then I realized that I have never taken a picture in my whole life. So I asked Béla to give his talk, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Erdős was a giant of mathematics and an amazing man. Excuse me, do you know what that is? No. So, not only did he start many fields of mathematics and worked in even more, he also wrote an enormous number of papers and had more collaborators than anyone ever. He traveled the world essentially all the time with a handful of possessions. He had friends in many countries and brought news of mathematics from one to the other. During the Cold War, he was the conduit of the Hungarian mathematicians to the West. He had lots of friends, and he was especially kind to young and occasionally very young mathematicians. On a personal level, I owe an enormous debt to Paul Erdős. It seems as if at every professional juncture of my life, he would have made the decision for me. I'm in combinatorics because of him, I'm in Cambridge because of him, and I'm in Memphis because of him. I met him when I was 14, and from then on, whenever he returned to Hungary, he very kindly invited me to talk to him. In fact, while I was still in school, he was kind enough to write a joint paper with me. It was he who suggested that I go to Cambridge and when I got a scholarship to Cambridge, it was he who really sent me to Trinity College, where his close friend, Harold Davenport, had been a fellow. Many years later, it was he who suggested that I would like Memphis, because he loved Memphis, where he had several of his closest collaborators and extremely good friends. And unfortunately, he died very soon after that, but while I was in Cambridge, he came to visit me several times a year, essentially every year. Now, let me show you some more pictures of Erdős. So after his PhD, he went to Manchester, where he worked in the excellent group of Louis Mordell. So here he is in in the center, on the, going from the left, it's Mordell, of course, Erdős, Harold Davenport next to him, and Chao Ko on the right. And here is a picture they love very much, especially Davenport, and they called it Professor Soul. When he returned to Hungary, he was reunited with his mother, and from then on, they were inseparable. Towards the end of his mother's life, she traveled with him everywhere, and in fact even died in Canada. When I returned from Cambridge in the first time, then the Diracs visited us and stayed with us for 6 weeks or so. And during that period, of course, Erdős and his mother often came to us. So here they are with Eric Milner. Unfortunately, Dirac is with his back to us. And here are the great friends in Memphis, Faudry, Rousseau, and Schelp. Now, let me turn to mathematics a bit. First of all, a terrible disclaimer. I shall talk about random graphs, how it started, where it goes, and it's a ridiculous task because I would need several dozen lectures to give it to do justice to the topic. And there are lots of you who know a hell of a lot about random graphs, so all I can say is that I shall just scrape the surface of the field, and many apologies to all of you for not saying much more. There is a little more in the paper, in the volume with Oliver Reardon. So, how it all started, the very first sentence of the first paper really starts, let us consider a random graph, and so on. So they start immediately, they consider graphs with n fixed vertices, labeled vertices, and m edges, and take all the graphs with m edges with these vertex set and consider it as a probability space, and that was the start. So here are the two founders in the famous photograph discussing, I'm sure, mathematics. Now, actually, there is a prehistory of random graphs. Erdős-Rényi were not quite the first to start it. Uhlenbeck several times spoke about it and wrote about it, and then a little later, Gilbert, whom I understand has just died, introduced another space of random graphs, which one tends to call G and P, which again consists of all graphs with vertex set n, the first n natural numbers, in which a graph is obtained by selecting an edge with probability p independently of all other events. The question even Gilbert was interested in is the probability that such a random graph is connected. So I really wanted to consider this question, just as in the first Erdős-Rényi paper, that was the main theme, that was the topic of the paper. But Gilbert attacked this wonderful probabilistic model using exact calculations, using generating functions, and then going on to asymptotics and trying to prove results which are easily understood. So in particular, he proved this result, which is much weaker than the Erdős-Rényi result on the same field, in the same topic. Now, what was the revolutionary idea of Erdős-Rényi? That we don't have to calculate exactly. There is no need for generating function. There is no need to know exactly how many structures there are. It's enough to take a probabilistic point of view use methods of probability and get some asymptotic results. So the model they studied, somewhat strangely, is exactly the size model in which we specify the number of edges and we take all graphs with that many edges. And what they wanted to know is what a typical random graph looks like. Although officially we do have a probability space. Most graphs in this space look the same. So they really look like as if they were determined fixed graphs. Now, how did they actually approach the study of random graphs? They had this static point of view where we have this probability space where the graphs are already given, put there with m edges, and as if you were given a nice probability space, and they wanted to know what happens. Now, they use the notation gamma. Nowadays, one always uses G. And the main question, so they were interested in, is connectedness. So, if m, the number of edges, is a function of the number of vertices, as of course it should be, for what functions is a random graph, G and M, likely to be connected? For what graphs is it likely to be disconnected? And the result they proved is a very sharp transition, a very sharp result, that if Mn is of this form, essentially log n times n over 2, then if the number of edges is a little bigger, the graph is almost surely connected, and if it's we have little fewer edges, then the graph is very likely to be disconnected. Wonderful result, way ahead of its time. Now, actually, although they worked with the model G and M, fixing the number of edges, they worked with the size model. In fact, for their calculations, they often use the binomial model, which they officially never defined and never really worked with. Because of that, because really the way we treat the binomial model is totally as Erdős and Rényi did, and absolutely not as Gilbert did. It's customary to call even G and P the classical random graph, or a classical random graph, or an Erdős-Rényi random graph, or a binomial random graph. There is also a somewhat more precise version of all that, the graph process, or the random graph process. So a graph process is simply a nested sequence of graphs with the same set of vertices, of course, starting with the empty graph and ending with the complete graph, in which the tth term in the sequence has exactly t edges, starting with 0, of course. Now, one may turn it into a probability space. That was really Erdős's idea. He was the first to have this idea that whatever large finite set you have, you may as well view it as a probability space by taking all the elements equiprobable. Now, let's do it here. Take all graph sequences and consider the elements equiprobable. When you pick one, you get a random graph process. Now, of course, there is another equivalent way of defining it. You take the empty graph, there are no edges, then pick an edge at random, add it to it, pick another edge at random, add it to it, where at random I mean uniformly at random from among the edges you don't yet have. And that also defines a random graph process. Of course, if you stop such a graph process when the time, this t, is exactly m, then you get nothing else but the model G and M, the size model. But if we work with the graph process, then we may define a finer measure of reaching a property, the hitting time. So that is the first, given a graph process, the hitting time on that graph process is the minimal value of t for which g and t is in the process. So when we take connectedness, the heating time of connectedness is the very first time the graph becomes connected. Now, formulating it that way, one can show, and it's easy to show, and they essentially showed that the heating time of connectedness is exactly the heating time of having minimal degree at least 1, having no isolated vertices with high probability, with probability tending to 1. So if you take a random graph process and all you follow is the degrees, then you can, of course, say easily whether a graph has an isolated vertex or not, stop the process as soon as the very last isolated vertex vanishes, look at the graph, and what you find is that the graph is connected. And from there, the previous result follows very easily. Now, the first paper ended with a promise that we are going to produce another paper, an even more detailed study of the structure of the graph. So they promised to take essentially a random graph process and see how the component structure changes. They also said, of course, this process had been studied or was studied in this graph exactly around log n over 2. Okay, so they promised to return to the paper, and they indeed did. They returned to it in the paper on the evolution of random graphs, which really is the main Erdős-Rényi paper of enormous influence on the theory of random graphs. A little later, they published an abstract in Japan. And it really took decades to grasp the importance of this paper. Actually, from the fact that Erdős and Rényi published all their papers in Hungarian journals, one suspects that not even they thought that the topic would be such a roaring success. In particular, this big paper was published in the Journal of the Institute and not in the Journal für Wahrscheinlichkeitstheorie, where it should have been published, for example. Okay, so the paper was dedicated to Paul Turán on his 50th birthday, another of Paul Erdős's close friends, and certainly one of my favorite and greatest professors. Here he is with Vera, his wife, and on the left is Mrs. Rényi's wife, Kató. Now, what are the main discoveries they made in this evolution paper? There were really two threads. One, that the random graph process undergoes a phase transition around the time n over 2. And that is really the main topic for me today. And the second is that many monotone properties arise very suddenly. Connectedness arose extremely suddenly. Other properties arise also fairly suddenly. Now, let me just give you this officially single theorem, but it takes quite a while to state it. They wrote this summary themselves, so it's a quote verbatim with occasional changes, or no, not even changing gamma. So they take this random graph process, and as the number of edges is increasing, as this living organism acquires more and more edges, it goes through a number of different phases. In phase 1, when the number of edges is just little o n, little o the number of vertices, then the graph almost surely consists of trees. Every component is a tree, and they tend to be small trees with a given order of magnitude. They also could easily calculate the distribution of these trees. The biggest trees occur with essentially Poisson the distribution. I intended to say that, of course, I shall assume that you know nothing about random graphs, otherwise I wouldn't give you these results, but I'm also assuming essentially infinite intelligence, so that I'm not dwelling hours on various transparencies. So that's phase one, little o n vertices. Second phase is when we have already a constant n is the number of vertices, constant n edges, but this constant is strictly less than 1/2. And then they are already, these graphs already contain cycles of any fixed order with some probability tending to a number between 0 and 1, neither 0 nor 1. And again, all components are either trees or unicyclic graphs, and still essentially all vertices are on trees. And also one can determine easily the mean number of components, which is essentially the minimal number, the maximum number it could be. Now phase 3 is starting to be even more interesting. That really is the exciting part of it. When m is about Cn, we see at least 1/2. When the number of edges passes through the threshold n/2, the structure of the random graph changes abruptly. Now, does this microphone work as well? I don't know where. It's not clear where I should stand. Probably I should have been standing here all the time. Yeah, still. So, when it passes through n/2, then exciting things happen. And in fact, they wrote that, as a matter of fact, the sudden change is the most surprising fact they discovered about the evolution of random graphs. Now, for C less than 1/2, the largest component is still a tree and has about constant times log n vertices, but easily given more precisely. But for m about n/2, the largest component has about n/2/3 vertices and has a complex structure. And if m is bigger than, if C is bigger than 1/2, then with m about Cn, the largest component has suddenly got linear order. There is a giant component, as they called it, and we'll call it later. And this component has about a certain number of edges, gc times n, where this function g is given below. Now, of course, if you have never seen this function, it certainly looks very strange, but the explanation is extremely simple, because except for this giant component, all the other components are relatively small, and most of them are trees. So if you can count the number of vertices on trees, and you take it away from n, then you find the size of the giant component. That's exactly what they did, and it's easy to calculate the number of vertices, expected number of vertices on small trees. Now, again, they think of it as a living organism, that the characterization of it is that these small trees melt into a large component, and the giant component component arises. Now, in phase 4, according to Erdős-Rényi, the number of edges is constant times n log n. That was exactly the part where connectedness occurred, where we went from being disconnected with high probability to being connected with high probability, but they also proved this quite a bit sharper result about the whole structure. Now in phase 5, we have even more edges, substantially more than n times log n. And in this range, the graph is almost surely, of course, connected, but not only is it connected, but the degrees are very close to each other. The degree distribution is essentially flat. The graph is asymptotically regular. Now, they also gave an even more succinct description of this, which I give here, that the largest component is of order log n for C less than 1/2, of order n to 2/3 for C, C 1/2, and of order n if C is greater than 1/2, provided the number of edges is about C times n. And this double jump is the most striking fact concerning random graphs they discovered. So the conclusion was double jump at about n/2. Now, they also studied threshold functions, in particular, as we already saw. The threshold of connectedness is about n log n/2. Actually, many years later, Andrew Thomas and I noticed that, in fact, the Kruskal-Kató implies that every monotone property has a threshold in a weak sense, a weak threshold, and later much deeper results were proved by Kalai and Lineal, the famous KKL theorem, continued by Burgi and Kahn, Kalai, Kastners and Lineal, and further taken by Friedgut and Kalai, Friedgut, and many others. This is a much deeper area than the one I mentioned just now. And the little advertisement that Thomas Wuchak will give a lecture on Friday about threshold functions. Now, that was in the original paper. Now, for quite a while, all that remained is that there is this double jump, and not much further work happened. Really, it all just shows that the evolution paper was way before its time. In the Metz reviews, Riordan reviewed it without noticing in the slightest that this was an important paper. Let me remind you of Littlewood's dictum that a first proof may be too complicated, may not be the right proof, a breakthrough may have imperfections. This certainly applies to this fantastic, groundbreaking paper of Erdős and Rényi, because as it happens, several of the results were not quite correct as stated, including the phase transition result. Because if the number of edges is a little bit bigger than n/2, if m minus n/2 grows a little faster than n to 2/3, then there is already a giant component in the sense that there is a noticeably larger component than the rest. So writing L1, L2, and so on for the orders of the components of a graph G, in 1984, this is a result from 1984, that in that case, already the largest component has 4s vertices, while the second largest is much, much smaller. So in fact, there isn't a jump, of course, and if you think about it, of course, it's obvious there cannot be a jump. It was a bit of a typo that they wrote that the number of edges twiddles n/2 had they written equals n over 2 and had they realized it was that, I'm sure Erdős himself would have asked for the finer nature of the phase transition. The proof of that result was very much in the spirit of Erdős-Rényi. Still, although I made use of the random graph process, the static point of view was used. In 1990, Tomek Vucek gave a much better argument, and he narrowed the gap from the time. I mean, he really went down to the very beginning of the process when the giant component appears, where giant, all the giant we mean by a giant that it's at least, let's say, twice as big as the second largest component. And the true result is that if S is at least omega n times n to the 2 over 3, and where omega goes to infinity, and the number of edges is n over 2 plus this extra S, then already we have a giant component, a component with 4s vertices, and the second largest is much smaller. Okay, so that of course really tells us that there are 3 phases of the phase transition of the random graph process. In the subcritical phase, the number of edges shouldn't be capital N, it should be little m, many apologies. The number of edges is really bounded away from n over 2 by a large multiple of n to the 2 over 3. Then in the critical phase, when the difference between the number of edges and n over 2 is big O n to the 2 over 3, in that case there are several largest components. They may even have about the same sizes, and they have even after rescaling, they have a non-trivial distribution. And then there is the supercritical case when we are getting away from n over 2 by more than a large multiple of n to the 2 over 3. In that case, the giant component has already emerged and has an asymptotically fixed size. And in the process, this giant component will not be overtaken again by 65 other components uniting and forming another component. Now, actually, there is an aspect of the theory of random graphs process where there is a genuine jump. This is in the K core, the unique maximal subgraph of minimal degree at least K. It's very easy to see that if you fix your K at least 2, for 1 we had the connectedness result, but fixing it for 2, no, not even connected. For 1, as soon as you have 1 edge, you have got a 1 core, so that's a silly thing, so K should be at least 2. So if there is this phase transition result, trivial phase transition result, that there is some constant Ck, that if the number of edges is less than C, is C times n with C less than Ck, then we are unlikely to have a core, but if the C is bigger than Ck, then we are very likely to have a core. And this Ck is big OK. That's a very weak result. With Andrew Thomason, we proved other pretty weak bounds on Ck, and the first proper result was proved by Vasek Fatal in 1991 about C3. But much better things were to come. In 1991, Vucek proved that the K core for K at least 2, 3, not even 2, 3, takes off with a bang. If K is fixed and is at least 3, then whatever number of edges, again I've taken the wrong function, the K core of this graph either contains no vertices or at least some positive constant times n vertices. So let's state it even more precisely. So let's write tau k core for the hitting time of the k core. So this is the time when the k core appears. And then let's look at the size of the k core at the very moment it is born. And that is S k core. Then the very precise result, and really quite a wonderful result proved by Pittel, Spencer, and Wormold in '96, is that both CK and SK are happily determined using the Poisson distribution, easy functions of the Poisson distribution. And more recently, Oliver Reardon proved a much more general result using a simpler proof based on branching processes. Now, there are also special subgraphs of the k core. Once you know you have the minimal degree is k, it's natural to ask, is it any nicer? Is it, for example, Hamiltonian? Does it maybe have two disjoint Hamilton cycles, whatever? And there is this beautiful theorem of Krivelevich, Lubetsky, and Sudakov, which is about to be published, that if k is not too small, then the k core is Hamiltonian. Not only is it Hamiltonian, but for large k, the k core consists lots of edge disjoint Hamilton cycles. And this is, as soon as it is born, it contains lots of Hamilton cycles. It's a wonderful proof. Unfortunately, of course, we can't go into it. And the result is almost best possible because we certainly cannot have more than k minus 1 over 2 disjoint Hamilton cycles. So, as I said, Paul Erdős visited me at least once a year in Cambridge, until the very end. And of course, we worked quite a lot and very happily. Often he was, of course, exhausted after having thought so hard, and not infrequently we had other visitors like Saharon Shella. And then, of course, I also liked it when he talked to my students like Imre Lieder, Ellen Stacey, Andrew Thomason, and Alexander Scott. He traveled with a handful of possessions, and of course, when he was about to take off, then he had to pack, and usually he enlisted the help of Vera, or in our case, always Gabriella. So here they are packing where to put this shoe. And I drove him out to the station, and even at the station, of course, we continued talking about mathematics. Now, I thought I may give you some ideas about proofs, but I doubt that I shall. And I wanted to say from the beginning, as I'm scratching the surface, in a way it's irrelevant where I finish, because whether I say few percent or 1% more makes very little difference. So in Cambridge, Paul Erdős was awarded an honorary degree, and here he is with Mary Robinson, the man on the right of the picture is Sir Alec Guinness, just about the greatest actor ever. Next to him is Gilles de Gennes, the Nobel Prize winner physicist. Here they are walking, followed by Stefan Heim and Sir Leslie Martin, the great architect. After the ceremony, Paul told us that he asked Alec Guinness what he was doing, and I was just hoping that he didn't ask it in his usual way. From an actor, his standard question was, "Where are you shouting?" Occasionally, this didn't go down too well in our house. Actually, he also asked the Archbishop of Canterbury on the same occasion what he was doing. And they had a good conversation about Ramsay, who was the brother of an archbishop. Okay, I'm not sure I can even say, but still let me finish with some more detailed results about the phase transition, because a little later or quite a bit later, in 94, tremendous activity started again. Maybe the first paper was the giant paper of Jansson, Knuth, Vucak, and Pittel, where they resurrected the use of generating functions. They put together algebraic and analytic combinatorial techniques to prove much sharper results. And here is Don Knuth again visiting us at home in Cambridge. And let me just finish with this result, that writing LK, reminding you that we write LK for the number of vertices in the kth largest component. Pittel and Wormhole proved in 2005 that a certain rho, which is the survival probability of a branching process I didn't show you, appears in the distribution of L1. So L1 suitably centered and suitably normalized, as it shows there, tends to the standard normal distribution. More recently, Nachmias and Perez used random walks and martingales to give a very simple proof of a slightly weaker result, and even more recently, Oliver Rearder and I used branching processes to give also a very simple proof of the full theorem. Now, I started by saying, I started by saying that I owe an enormous debt to Paul Erdős, and it's true, and essentially he made all the important decisions in my life. I'm very proud to say that I found my wife myself, but essentially everything else important was due to him. Of course, I miss him ridiculously, and I'm delighted that I could get through this lecture. Thank you very much.
Itt van fönn, vagy még van előtt egy jó ideg, van egy szünet előtt.
Most aki működik minden még, ugye?
Igen, most működik.